The jungle held its breath. A minute ago, it had been a cacophony of screeching birds and chattering insects. Now it was silent, as if the very earth was waiting. High in the canopy, nestled in a cradle of thick vines and gnarled branches, Petty Officer Second Class Lena Wraith Cruz did not breathe at all. She was a part of the tree, a statue of shadows and muted green camouflage. Her eye was pressed to the scope of her M40A5. The world narrowed to a single magnified circle of mud, leaves, and a man. He was her target. A ghost in the intelligence files, now solid and real, standing arrogantly in a clearing 200 yards away. He was speaking into a satellite phone, his bodyguards looking bored. Lena's finger rested lightly on the trigger, the pad of her index finger feeling the cool, precise metal. The crosshairs were steady, centered on his sternum. She had already calculated for the humid, thick air, for the slight thermal updraft coming from the valley below. The rifle was an extension of her will. In her ear, the voice of her team leader, Corsair, was a calm, digital whisper. "Wind holding. You are cleared hot, Wraith." There was no hesitation. The rifle roared, a single sharp crack that shattered the unnatural silence. The sound was not loud to her. It was expected. A release of kinetic energy she had already felt in her bones. Through the scope, she saw the target crumple, a puppet with its strings cut. The bodyguards froze for a fatal second, then erupted into frantic, disorganized movement, firing their AK-47s into the empty jungle. "Target neutralized," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. She worked the bolt of the M40, the spent brass cartridge spinning away and disappearing into the dense foliage below. The smell of burnt cordite, a scent she associated with finality, filled her nostrils. "Copy that, Wraith. Good shot. Fall back to the LZ. Rally point Delta, now. Corsair's voice was still calm, but there was an urgency there that hadn't been there before. Lena moved with a fluid, practiced economy. She slid from her perch, her boots finding silent purchase on the moss-slick bark. She melted back into the jungle, a ghost retreating. The plan was perfect. In 5 minutes, she would link up with Corsair and the other 2 members of her SEAL team, Doc and Smoke. In 10, the heavy thump of the extraction helicopter would be their ticket out of this green hell. But the jungle had other plans. She was halfway to the landing zone when the radio traffic in her earpiece shifted. The calm, coded phrases were gone, replaced by sharp, strained voices. "Contact front! Heavy weapons! Smoke, frag left!" "They're flanking us." How did they know? The sound of gunfire, once distant, was now a raging storm just ahead. It was no chance encounter. This was a planned, well-executed ambush. Someone had known they were coming. Lena broke into a low, crouching run, her rifle held tight against her body, vines and branches whipping at her arms. She burst into the small, makeshift landing zone just in time to see the world erupt in fire and noise. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked out of the tree line on the far side, its tail a fiery comet. It missed the team by feet, exploding against a giant kapok tree and sending a shower of splintered wood and shredded leaves into the air. The concussion wave hit Lena like a physical blow, staggering her. Through the smoke and chaos, she saw Corsair and Doc laying down a devastating field of fire, covering Smoke, who was calling in the exfil bird. "Wraith." "On me!" Corsair yelled, his voice raw. She moved toward him, but another explosion, closer this time, threw her off her feet. She landed hard on her right side, a searing, white-hot pain exploding in her shoulder. Her head cracked against a root, and her world swam for a moment. Gasping, she tried to push herself up, but her right arm wouldn't obey. It hung useless, the joint screaming in protest. Dislocated. Worse, the small communication unit on her vest was a mangled mess of plastic and wires, a victim of the blast. She was deaf to her team, and they were deaf to her. She looked up, her vision blurring. The extraction helicopter was there now, a magnificent, roaring beast hovering just above the clearing. Smoke was already on board, reaching down. Doc was firing his weapon on full auto, providing a final wall of cover. Corsair was backing towards the skid, his eyes scanning the tree line. His eyes swept right past where she lay in the mud and the ferns. He saw a body, a motionless form in camouflage. He saw the damaged gear. He saw what the enemy wanted him to see. A KIA, a body that couldn't be recovered under the heavy fire. The decision was written on his face in a fraction of a second. A horrible, agonizing, but necessary decision. Lena tried to shout, but only a choked gasp came out. She tried to raise her good arm, but a fresh volley of enemy fire stitched the ground near her, forcing her down. She saw Corsair's jaw clench. He gave a sharp, pained shake of his head, then turned and leaped onto the helicopter skid. The bird peeled away, climbing fast, its minigun spitting fury back at the jungle as it disappeared into the gray sky. The sound of its rotors faded, replaced by the victorious shouts of the enemy soldiers now swarming the clearing. They thought they had won. They had killed a SEAL team member. They had no idea that the most dangerous one of all was still here, wounded, alone, and watching them from the shadows. The mud was cool against her cheek. For a long moment, Lena Cruz did not move. She simply existed in that space between the blast and the aftermath, the world a muffled, painful hum. The shouts of the enemy soldiers were distant, distorted, as if she were listening from the bottom of a well. They were celebrating, their boots churning the earth just meters from her hiding place in the thick ferns. One of them kicked a piece of her shattered comms gear, sending it skittering into the jungle. They believed her to be dead. It was the only advantage she had left. Slowly, agonizingly, she pushed herself up with her left arm. Her right shoulder was a white-hot knot of agony, the joint grotesquely out of place. Every tiny movement sent fresh waves of nausea crashing over her. She had to get away from the LZ. They would soon search the area more thoroughly, and her shallow scrape in the earth would not hold up to scrutiny. Clenching her jaw, she used her left hand to drag her M40 rifle closer. The familiar weight of the polished wood and cold steel was an anchor in a world that had come completely unmoored. This was her voice now. This was her only friend. She began to crawl. It was a slow, torturous process, an inchworm's progress through the damp, rotting leaves. Each time she had to put weight on her right side, a strangled gasp would escape her lips. She focused on the sounds around her, using the enemy's own noise to mask her own. Their laughter, their guttural commands, the rustle of their gear as they began to loot the abandoned equipment at the LZ, it all became a screen for her escape. She moved deeper into the jungle, away from the clearing and the fading scent of cordite and jet fuel. After what felt like an eternity, she found a small depression behind the massive, buttressed roots of a fallen ironwood tree. It was a hollow of relative safety, shielded from view. She collapsed into it, her body trembling from shock and pain. The adrenaline was fading, and the full, brutal reality of her situation was settling in. Alone, behind enemy lines, no communications, and severely injured. She looked at her shoulder. It was a professional assessment, a sniper's dispassionate analysis of a problem. She could not fight. She could not move effectively. She could not even hold her rifle steady with the joint dislocated. It had to be fixed. Now. Her eyes scanned the immediate area, landing on a sturdy, Y-shaped branch jutting from the fallen tree. It was thick, solid. It would have to do. Lena unbuckled her combat webbing with her left hand, her movements clumsy and slow. She shrugged it off, then began the difficult task of removing her plate carrier. Every shift of the heavy vest was a fresh lesson in pain. Finally, free of the bulk, she sat in her damp undershirt, the jungle air cool on her sweat-soaked skin. She positioned herself on her knees, her back to the fallen tree. She wedged the Y of the branch firmly into her armpit, the wood digging into her flesh. This was the easy part. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she gripped her right wrist with her left hand. She thought of her godfather, the Master Chief, his voice calm and steady in her memory. The body is just a machine, Lena, and a warrior knows how to fix her tools. She closed her eyes. This was not going to be a gentle process. It was going to be an act of violence upon her own body. She leaned forward, putting her full weight into the pull, simultaneously pushing her body away from the anchored branch. The pain was immediate and blinding, a fire that consumed all thought. Stars exploded behind her eyelids. She bit down on the strap of her rifle sling, the taste of leather and grit filling her mouth, muffling the scream that fought to tear itself from her throat. She leaned further, muscles straining, tendons screaming in protest. There was a terrible grinding pop, a sensation that was more sound and vibration than feeling. The fire in her shoulder vanished, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache. She slumped forward, her forehead pressing into the cool, damp earth. She spat out the rifle sling, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. Tears of pain and relief mingled with the dirt on her face. For a full minute, she just lay there, waiting for the world to stop spinning. But she had done it. The machine was fixed. The tool was operational. Slowly, she sat up, testing the arm. It was weak, the pain still a powerful presence, but it was in the socket. She could move it. The throbbing in her shoulder was a brutal, rhythmic drum counting down the seconds she had left. Lena lay perfectly still in the root hollow, her breathing so shallow it barely stirred the leaf litter in front of her face. The enemy's celebration at the LZ was winding down. The casual, victorious shouts were being replaced by sharper, more organized commands. The search was beginning. They would fan out, looking for intelligence, for souvenirs, for bodies. It was only a matter of time before a boot stepped into her hiding place. She had to move. But movement was a declaration. It would create sound, it would disturb the environment, it would leave a trail. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to put as much distance between herself and the ambush site as possible. But her training, drilled into her over thousands of hours, whispered a different, colder strategy. The enemy would expect her to run. They would expect panic, a desperate animal fleeing deeper into the jungle. So she would not run. She would do the one thing they would never anticipate. She would stalk them. With the infinite patience of a predator, she inched her way up the massive, fallen ironwood tree, using its bulk as cover. The bark was rough and wet against her palms. Every shift of her body was a calculated risk, a slow-motion ballet of controlled movement. She reached a vantage point where the roots splayed out, creating a narrow fissure just wide enough for her and her rifle. It was a new hide, a new beginning. She peered through the tangled screen of roots and ferns. Below, the enemy soldiers were forming into rough search parties. One three-man team was heading directly toward her previous position. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She pressed herself lower, becoming a part of the shadows and the rot. The soldiers passed within 15 feet of her, their eyes scanning the middle distance, their muzzles pointing at nothing. They walked right past the root hollow she had just vacated, never glancing down. They had already written it off. As the immediate danger passed, a cold, analytical calm settled over her. This was no longer about survival. It was a tactical problem. She took a silent inventory. Her M40 was clean and functional. She opened the ammo pouch on her belt. 18 rounds. Each one was a precious, finite resource. Each one was a statement. She had half a canteen of water. Her only food was a single compressed protein bar. The numbers were stark. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and isolated. But she held two things they did not: the high ground and the absolute certainty of the unseen. She watched the enemy commander. He was a tall, lean man with a radio handset pressed to his ear, barking orders from the center of the clearing. He was the brain. He was the coordination. He moved with an arrogant confidence, believing the only remaining threat had flown away in that helicopter. He was pointing, directing his men to sweep east, deeper into the jungle. He was looking for a ghost, running for its life. He never once looked up into the trees surrounding his position. Lena's fingers tightened around the stock of her M40. A plan, brutal and simple, began to form in her mind. It was a sniper's calculus. She would not waste her precious rounds on low-value targets. She would not engage in a fair fight. She would decapitate the enemy, sow chaos, and use their own fear as a weapon. She would turn their numerical advantage into a liability. They would become a headless snake, thrashing in its own confusion. She slowly, silently, pushed the barrel of her rifle through the gap in the roots. The familiar weight was a comfort. She settled into the weapon, her body aligning with it as if they were one single entity designed for this single purpose. She peered through the scope. The world narrowed once more to a circle of clarity. The crosshairs found the commander. He was laughing now, slapping one of his men on the back. He felt utterly secure. Lena's breathing stilled. The jungle sounds faded into a dull hum. There was only the target, the wind, a gentle 2-mile-per-hour breeze from the left, the humidity, the slight downward angle. Her finger rested on the trigger, taking up the slack. She was no longer Petty Officer Lena Cruz, the abandoned soldier. She was Wraith, and she was about to introduce herself. The crosshairs held steady on the center of the commander's chest. He was still laughing, a picture of triumphant carelessness. Lena's world had shrunk to the circle of her scope, a universe where only she and this man existed. The gentle pressure on the trigger was as natural as a heartbeat. There was no anger in the act, no hatred, only a profound and terrible necessity. The rifle roared. The sound was a physical thing, a single sharp crack that ripped through the celebratory chatter in the clearing. Through the scope, she saw the man's chest explode in a puff of dust and fabric. He was thrown backward, his radio clattering to the ground. The laughter around him died instantly, replaced by a frozen, disbelieving silence. For one full second, nothing happened. The enemy soldiers were statues, their minds refusing to process the sudden violent death of their leader. Then, chaos. It did not erupt slowly, it detonated. A few men dropped to the ground, scanning the tree line. Others, less disciplined, began firing their AK-47s in wild, panicked bursts, spraying bullets into the jungle at random. The air was suddenly thick with the deafening rattle of automatic weapons fire and the confused, shouting voices of men who had just lost their head. Lena was already moving. She worked the bolt of the M40, the spent cartridge ejecting with a soft ping lost in the din. She did not look at the result of her shot. She knew what it was. She slid backwards from her root hide, low and silent, like a serpent retreating into its burrow. She had to shift position. A sniper who fires twice from the same location is a dead sniper. She moved 20 yards to the right, finding a new vantage point behind a thick curtain of hanging lianas. The enemy's fire was still concentrated on her previous position. They were shooting at a ghost. She settled in, her breathing even, her movements economical. She scanned the chaos below, looking for order emerging from the madness. It did not take long. A soldier with a heavy radio pack on his back was crouching behind a tree, frantically trying to key the handset, to call for reinforcements, to re-establish command and control. He was the new brain, or at least he was trying to be. Lena's crosshairs found him. He was partially obscured by the tree, but his shoulder and the side of the radio were exposed. It was a more difficult shot, but it was not a shot she could afford to miss. She adjusted her aim minutely, accounting for the slight increase in range. She exhaled slowly, and as her lungs emptied, she squeezed the trigger. The second shot was just as precise as the first. The radio operator spun with the impact, a dark spray arcing from his shoulder. The heavy radio unit sparked and crackled, then went silent. Another vital node in their network had been severed. The effect was immediate and profound. The sporadic return fire from the enemy became even more frantic, more disorganized. Without a leader and without communications, they were no longer a platoon. They were a collection of terrified, isolated men. Lena moved again. This time, she went higher, climbing with a grim determination, finding a perch where two large branches of a mahogany tree formed a natural rifle rest. From here, she had a commanding view of the entire clearing. The enemy was now a textbook example of a force in disarray. Some were trying to rally, pointing vaguely in different directions. Others were simply firing from the hip, expending ammunition at shadows. A few had already begun to retreat, melting back into the jungle from where they came. They were no longer hunters. They were victims of an invisible, omnipresent enemy they could not understand or engage. The ambush they had so carefully planned had been utterly dismantled, turned into a devastating chaos orchestrated by a single determined woman and her rifle. The jungle had become a shooting gallery, and she was the sole operator. From her new perch in the mahogany tree, Lena watched the chaos unfold with a sniper's dispassionate eye. The enemy was a headless snake, thrashing wildly, poisoning itself with its own fear. She had 3 targets left in her mind before she would be forced to disengage and vanish. The machine gunner, whose sustained fire could still pose a threat to any rescue attempt. The most vocal of the remaining junior leaders, a man trying desperately to shout orders over the panic. And finally, any soldier who seemed to be successfully rallying others. She found the machine gunner first. He had set up his bipod on a fallen log, his belt of ammunition feeding clumsily into the receiver. He was firing long, wasteful bursts into the trees on the far side of the clearing, convinced the threat was there. Lena's crosshairs settled on the center of his back. The shot was almost too easy. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a fresh jolt of pain that she acknowledged and then dismissed. The gunner slumped forward, his weapon falling silent. The cessation of its relentless chatter was as loud as the gunfire itself, another layer of their firepower stripped away. She worked the bolt, the smooth mechanical action, a ritual of death. The spent casing tumbled down through the branches, disappearing into the ferns below. She shifted her aim, scanning for the shouting man. He was near the body of the commander, waving his arms, trying to pull two cowering soldiers into a defensive perimeter. He had courage. It would get him killed. Lena exhaled, paused at the natural respiratory pause, and squeezed. The man's shouting ceased mid-syllable, his body crumpling to the ground. The two soldiers he had been trying to rally immediately broke, scrambling away on their hands and knees, their will to fight completely shattered. Silence began to reclaim the clearing, but it was a new kind of silence. It was not the quiet of the jungle. It was a thick, heavy silence of pure terror. The remaining enemy soldiers were frozen, pressed against trees or lying flat in the mud, too afraid to move, too afraid to fire. They knew any sound, any motion could draw the attention of the phantom in the trees. They were waiting to die. Lena used their paralysis. She slid down from the mahogany tree, her body a whisper of movement. She had to put distance between herself and this place. They would eventually call for reinforcements, or an officer with a shred of courage would take charge. Her work here was done. She moved like smoke, flowing through the undergrowth, her senses hyper-alert. She counted her remaining ammunition in her head. 12 rounds. She had turned the tide with 6 precise shots. She found a small, fast-moving stream and waded into it, the cold water a shock to her system. She moved upstream, her boot slipping on the mossy stones, knowing the water would mask her trail from any trackers they might eventually send. After 100 yards, she climbed out on the far bank, the water streaming from her trousers. She found a dense thicket of thorny bamboo and pushed her way into its heart, creating a small, concealed hollow. She was exhausted, every muscle screaming in protest, her shoulder a throbbing mass of pain. But she was alive, and she had done the impossible. She allowed herself a single long drink from her canteen. The water was warm and tasted of plastic, but it was life itself. She leaned her head back against a bamboo stalk, the M40 resting across her knees. The immediate, overwhelming need to fight was gone, replaced by a deep, gnawing emptiness. She was still alone. She was still behind enemy lines. The victory in the clearing was tactical, a temporary reprieve. The strategic reality remained grim. She closed her eyes, listening. Beyond the rustle of the bamboo, she could hear nothing but the normal sounds of the jungle slowly returning. The birds were tentatively beginning to call again. The insects were resuming their hum. The world was moving on, uncaring of the small private war that had just been fought. She was a ghost again, but now she was a ghost with a purpose. She had to survive. She had to get home. The promise etched into her soul, the one her team lived by, now felt like a personal commandment she had to fulfill for herself. No one left behind, not even her. The thorny bamboo thicket was a cage of her own making, but it was a safe cage. Lena sat perfectly still, her body aching with a fatigue so profound it felt like a physical weight. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the ambush and its bloody aftermath had drained away, leaving her hollowed out and trembling. She focused on the small, routine tasks to keep the despair at bay. She methodically cleaned the lens of her scope with a soft cloth from her kit, wiping away the mud and moisture. She checked the action of her M40, working the bolt slowly and silently to ensure no grit or debris had found its way inside. The familiar mechanical precision of the ritual was a comfort. It was something she could control. Her stomach growled, a sharp reminder of her dwindling resources. She pulled the single protein bar from her pocket. It was smashed and melted from the heat and her own body, but she unwrapped it carefully, treating it like a sacred offering. She broke it into 4 small pieces, rationing it for a future she could not see. She ate one piece, forcing herself to chew slowly to make it last. The bland, chalky taste was the best thing she had ever eaten. Time lost all meaning in the green gloom. Minutes bled into hours. She drifted in and out of a light, troubled sleep, her mind replaying the helicopter lifting away, the look on Corsair's face, the roar of her rifle. Each time she jolted awake, her hand would instinctively tighten around the stock of her M40, her eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of bamboo for a threat that had not yet come. It was a sound that finally pulled her fully back to alertness. A distant, rhythmic thumping, so low it was more a vibration in the air than a true sound. At first she thought it was her own heartbeat thudding in her ears, but it grew steadily louder, more distinct. It was mechanical. It was man-made, her breath caught in her throat. Hope, a dangerous and fragile emotion, flared in her chest. She pushed herself up, wincing as her injured shoulder protested the movement. She had to get to a vantage point. She had to see. She edged her way out of the thicket, moving with a renewed, desperate caution. The thumping was unmistakable now, the powerful, deep-throated beat of helicopter rotors. Not the light, nimble sound of the little bird that had extracted her team, but the heavier, more authoritative thump of a larger aircraft, a pave hawk, a Caesar bird. She scrambled up a steep, muddy incline, using roots and vines to pull herself up. She reached a small, rocky outcrop that broke through the jungle canopy, giving her a sliver of a view of the sky. Her heart soared. There in the distance were two MH-60 Pavehawks flying in a tactical formation, heading directly for the ambush site. They were coming for her. They had not forgotten. But as the helicopters began to circle the clearing, her elation turned to ice. From her high position, she could see movement in the tree line around the LZ. The enemy had not all fled. A handful of them, perhaps the most disciplined or the most terrified, had stayed, and they were preparing to fight. One soldier, bold or foolish, was wrestling with a long, tube-like weapon from a crate, an RPG-7. He was aiming it at the lead Pavehawk as it began its low, slow orbit, its crew undoubtedly scanning for any sign of her. Lena's mind went cold and clear. The calculations happened in an instant. Range 400 yards. Wind negligible. Angle steep downhill. It was a long shot, a difficult shot, but it was the only shot that mattered. The helicopter was a sitting duck, a massive, slow-moving target. That soldier with the rocket launcher held the lives of her rescuers in his hands. She dropped to the ground, bracing her rifle on the rock. The world narrowed once more to the circle of her scope. The crosshairs danced over the distant figure. He was loading the rocket, his movements frantic. She had seconds. She took a breath, let half of it out, and found the still point between her heartbeats. Her finger tightened on the trigger. This was not about chaos anymore. This was about salvation. This shot was for them. The world ceased to exist. There was only the man, the rocket launcher, and the unwavering crosshairs centered on his torso. 400 yards, a steep angle. Lena's body was a statue of concentration, every fiber, every nerve, dedicated to the single task of guiding the bullet true. She could not miss. The lives of the men in that helicopter, her only ticket home, depended on the perfection of this single moment. She exhaled slowly, a soft, controlled sigh. Her finger completed the squeeze. The rifle cracked, its report a sharp, final statement in the humid air. Through the scope, she saw the target jolt, stumble backward, and collapse. The rocket launcher clattered to the ground, unfired. A wave of cold relief washed over her. But it was short-lived. The shot had revealed her position. Muzzle flashes bloomed from the tree line below as the remaining enemy soldiers, now aware of the new threat, redirected their fire towards her rocky outcrop. Bullets whined off the stone around her, sending chips of rock flying. She worked the bolt, the spent casing spinning away. She had to protect the birds. She was their overwatch now. She scanned for the next most immediate threat. A soldier with an RPK light machine gun was setting up to provide suppressing fire, pinning down the helicopters. She found him in her scope, adjusted for the new, closer range, and fired again. The machine gun fell silent. The Pavehawks, now aware of the active resistance, peeled away, gaining altitude but staying on station. Their side doors were open, and Lena could see the dark shapes of para-rescue men ready on the ropes. They were looking for her. They knew she was here fighting. She had to give them a chance. She had to clear the LZ. She fired a third time, targeting a soldier who was trying to rally two others. He fell. The remaining enemy fire became sporadic, uncoordinated. The devastating psychological impact of her earlier sniping had returned. They were being methodically dismantled by an enemy they could not see or reach. Their will broke. She saw them now. 2, then 3, then 4 figures, abandoning their positions and fleeing headlong into the jungle, desperate to escape the deadly accuracy from the high ground. Silence fell once more, this time complete and total. The enemy was gone, routed. The only sound was the powerful, beautiful thrum of the pave hawks as one of them now descended towards the clearing, its rotor wash flattening the grass and whipping the trees. Lena watched, her body trembling with exhaustion and spent adrenaline. She had done it. She had held the line. She looked down at her rifle. The magazine was empty. She had fired her final round. She was now truly defenseless. But it didn't matter. The battle was over. She slowly, stiffly pushed herself to her feet. Her legs felt weak, like they might buckle at any moment. She stood on the rocky outcrop, a solitary, mud-caked figure silhouetted against the gray sky. She saw a PJ in the helicopter's door, his helmeted head scanning the area. She raised her good arm, a slow, weary wave. She saw him point directly at her. The helicopter shifted, turning its nose towards her position. It was over. The long, dark night of the soul she had endured in the jungle was finally ending. The promise had been kept. They had come back for her. As the helicopter moved in, the downdraft from its rotors washing over her like a cleansing rain, Lena Cruz finally allowed herself to believe it. She was going home. The downdraft from the pave hawk was a physical force, whipping her hair across her face and pressing her filthy uniform against her skin. Lena stood her ground on the rocky outcrop, her empty rifle held loosely in her left hand. She was a statue of exhaustion and resilience, her eyes fixed on the magnificent roaring machine that was her salvation. The side door was open, and a pararescue man, clad in a flight suit and helmet, was already hooking up a fast rope, his movements sharp and professional. He looked up at her, gave a sharp, acknowledging nod, and then slid down the thick, braided rope like a phantom, landing in a crouch just meters from her. He moved towards her, not with the rushed panic of a combat medic, but with the calm, assessing gaze of a professional who had done this many times before. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, taking in the dislocated shoulder she favored. The mud caked on her face, the way she held the empty M40 not as a weapon, but as a talisman. "Petty Officer Cruz?" He shouted over the rotor wash, his voice calm and steady. She just nodded, her throat too tight for words. "I'm Staff Sergeant Miller. We're here to bring you home." He didn't try to take her rifle. Instead, he gently guided her towards the fast rope. "Can you manage the descent? I'll be right behind you." Lena looked down at the rope, then back at her rocky perch, the place where she had fought her last desperate stand. This was the final barrier between the jungle and home. She slung her M40 over her good shoulder, the weight a familiar and comforting anchor. She gripped the thick rope with both hands, her injured shoulder screaming in protest, but she ignored it. This was nothing compared to what had come before. She rappelled down, her boots hitting the torn-up earth of the landing zone with a soft thud. Miller landed beside her a second later, his hand on her back, guiding her quickly towards the waiting helicopter. As they ran, her eyes swept across the clearing. She saw the bodies of the men she had shot. She saw the discarded enemy weapons, the shattered radio, the scorched earth from the initial RPG blast. It was a tableau of the chaos she had created and survived. There was no sense of victory, only a profound, hollowed-out weariness. Miller helped her up into the vibrating belly of the pavehawk. The inside was a cacophony of noise, the deafening roar of the engines, the rhythmic thumping of the rotors, the static-filled chatter on the intercom. Another PJ was there, and he helped her onto a red nylon seat, immediately beginning a tactical field assessment, checking her pulse, her pupils, her shoulder. As the helicopter lifted off, climbing steeply away from the green hell below, Lena turned and looked out the open door. The clearing shrank, becoming just a small, insignificant scar in the vast emerald canopy. The jungle that had been her prison, her battlefield, and her hiding place now looked small and distant. She had been to its darkest heart and had returned. The PJ, Miller, sat down opposite her. He handed her a canteen of cold water. She drank greedily, the water washing the taste of cordite and fear from her mouth. He then offered her a headset. She put it on, and the world suddenly became quieter, the engine noise muffled. A new voice, calm and authoritative, filled her ears. "Wraith, this is Kingfish Actual. We have you on scope. Good to have you back." It was the mission commander, likely on a command ship or a distant base. The formal recognition, the use of her call sign, broke through the last of her defenses. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a soldier who had completed her mission against impossible odds. "Copy that, Kingfish," she said, her voice rough and unfamiliar to her own ears. "Good to be back." She leaned her head back against the vibrating fuselage, closing her eyes. The images of the past hours flashed behind her eyelids, the blast, the pain, the crosshairs, the shots. But they were fading, being replaced by the solid, real sensation of the helicopter carrying her away. She thought of her team, of Corsair and Doc and Smoke. They would know by now. They would know she had held the line. The promise, etched into the soul of every service member, had held fast. No one left behind. She felt the weight of her empty rifle across her lap. It was no longer just a weapon. It was a witness. It was the instrument that had forged her path through the chaos and back into the light. She was going home.